Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now last year I did a what if video imagining Tom Baker leaving earlier than he did in our timeline. This video specifically had him leave at the end of season 15, with the invasion of time as his final story. But as I said in that video, there are a few other options for Tom Baker leaving earlier. He could have left at the end of season 14, or season 17, or season 16, which is what we'll be focusing on in this video. This is what if Tom Baker had left after season 16. So how would this alternate timeline come about? Well, in our timeline, Tom Baker caused quite the fuss when it came time to try to renew his contract for season 17 in late 1978 to early 1979. He had demanded more creative control over the show, saying that he would leave the show if he wasn't given it. He had done this because he felt that after spending 5 years working on the show, he should have more say in the making of the show, including choosing scripts, directors and casting. He had made his demands known to then BBC head of serials, Graham McDonald, and BBC One's controller of programmes, Bill Cotton. McDonald had instructed the show's producer Graham Williams to fire Tom Baker, although Williams felt like this was unnecessary as Baker had already sent him a note to say that he intended to quit the show. Now in our timeline, this all got resolved when Tom Baker had a meeting with the BBC's head of drama, Sean Sutton, where he agreed to not resign from the programme until further discussions had been held. To cut a long story short, after these further discussions had occurred, Tom Baker backed down and signed on for season 17, with him changing his mind over his demands for more creative control. But all of this could very easily have gone a different way. Baker could very well have never backed down and still tendered his resignation towards the end of season 16. Graham Williams and incoming script editor Douglas Adams would have had to hastily rewrite the ending of The Armageddon Factor to give Tom Baker a suitable enough exit from the show. I say Williams and Adams would have had to do this as writers Bob Baker and Dave Martin had let Williams basically write the concluding scene for the whole Key to Time arc himself. I couldn't find any particular reason why the Black Guardian only appeared on the TARDIS scanner during his confrontation with the Fourth Doctor, so we'll say he is able to physically appear in the TARDIS console room. He tries to snatch the key to time from the Doctor and Romana, leading to a brawl between him and the Doctor. The Doctor gains the upper hand and breaks the key apart into its 6 individual parts. This enrages the Black Guardian, causing him to fire an energy beam right at the Doctor, before disappearing into thin air, laughing maniacally. This causes the Doctor to collapse to the floor and regenerate into a brand new incarnation. But who would play this alternate Fifth Doctor? Well, it wouldn't be Peter Davison, as like I believe I said in my season 15 exit video, he wasn't a fan of the undergraduate humour, as he called it, of the Graham Williams era, so it would have to be someone else. 2 people that were considered for the part by JNT when he was casting the role for season 19 in our timeline were Richard Griffiths and Ian Cuthbertson. Obviously Griffiths would go on to be considered for the 8th Doctor if the show hadn't have been cancelled in 1989. But what about Cuthbertson? Obviously it would be a different producer, Graham Williams, casting for the 5th Doctor in this alternate timeline, but Cuthbertson would make more sense to be Williams' pick than you might think. The two had actually already worked together a few times. Cuthbertson had starred in Sutherland's Law, which Williams had worked as the scripts editor for, and Cuthbertson had recently made a guest appearance during Williams' tenure on Doctor Who as well, when he played Gowron in the Ribos operation, and the two would later work together yet again with the ITV children's series Supergran from 1986 to 1987, so it's not implausible that Williams could have thought of Cuthbertson to replace Tom Baker. So let's say that he goes with Cuthbertson for the alternate Fifth Doctor. An interesting thing to note is that Cuthbertson would predate some of our timeline's Doctors in a few aspects. He would beat Colin Baker to become the first actor to play a guest role in the show and then go on to also play the Doctor. And he would beat Sylvester McCoy to become the first Scottish actor to play the part. So what would Cuthbertson's costume have been like? Well, since he tended to like wearing big coats in everything he performed, based on what I could find on Google Images anyway, how about something along the lines of his look from The Railway Children? It looks probably the most doctory of all the costumes he wore that I could find. So why not? Even if that film was made about 9 years previously, so I don't know if it would be all that likely for the costume designers to use as a basis for his Doctor Who look. But anyway, I would have his costume be made up of a plaid-styled Inverness cape, which would cover up a smart black blazer, tweed waistcoat, and a red velvet cravat, tied at the top of a plain white shirt. His trousers would match his blazer with grey pirate boots and a tartan patterned short scarf, completing the whole thing. I've just realised now that the Inverness cape would give his costume a similar feel to Jon Pertwee's. I think Graham Williams would try to convince Mary Tamm to stay on as Romana for another season, just to help introduce a new Doctor to the audience, and to avoid having both the Doctor and Romana regenerate at the same time. He did try his best to get her to stay on in our timeline anyway, so it is pretty likely. Tamm might reluctantly agree to stay on, but would tell Williams that she wanted to leave halfway through season 17, rather than do the whole of it. Williams would agree to this with some hesitation, and Tamm would ask that she be given much better material in her final few stories, as she had felt like her character had become too much of the stereotypical damsel in distress type of female companion that was often an issue in the show's classic series. I think Lalla Ward would still be chosen to replace Mary Tamm, as Tamm herself had suggested her to Williams during the making of the Armageddon Factor, even though I believe part of the reason was because of how well Lalla Ward got on with Tom Baker, which would no longer matter if he was replaced by a new Doctor for the next season. Beyond Romana's regeneration happening halfway through it though, I can't imagine season 17 being all that different to how it was in our timeline. It would still be made up of the same stories, with Destiny of the Daleks now obviously being the first story for Ian Cuthbertson's Doctor. Even though I have used a similar idea for What Ifs in the past, I can imagine Romana taking much of the lead during the first couple of episodes of the story, as the Doctor recovers from his regeneration. This might be Graham Williams' attempt at trying to satisfy Mary Tamm's requests for more substantial material to work with. The Doctor would come to his senses for the latter half of the story though, and it would be interesting to see how Cuthbertson's Fifth Doctor would spar and verbally duel against David Goodison's Davros. City of Death would be the exact same as it was for us, and the creature from the pit would mostly be the same too, although there would now need to be a way of having Romana regenerate at the end of it. Perhaps the Lady Adrasta stabs Romana when she and the Doctor help Erato to tell the truth to Adrasta's people about what she had done. This would obviously be just before Erato crushes Adrasta to death, and the stabbing would have to have been done in as softened a way as possible to prevent the show being under any controversy with Mary Whitehouse again. Although having a companion get stabbed on screen would go against Graham Williams trying to move away from the previous era's sadism as he saw it. But regardless of how Romana would have regenerated at the end of The Creature from the Pit, she would then just be settling in to her new incarnation in Nightmare of Eden. And this is where we come to something to do with the production of this story, namely the drama with director Alan Bromley. Whilst you might think that this behind the scenes issue would never happen with Tom Baker no longer being there, I think it would still ultimately happen. Bromley was very uncompromising in how he talked to the actors, and I believe he basically treated Tom Baker and Lalla Ward as completely inexperienced fools in our timeline. And he also made several last minute changes to the recording schedule. So yeah, I reckon there would still be an issue even with Ian Cuthbertson there instead of Tom Baker. Bromley might very well have still quit directing the serial, forcing producer Graham Williams to step in and take his place. I believe it was after all this had happened that Williams had decided that season 17 would be his last as the show's producer, which means that if the drama around Nightmare of Eden's production still happens, then Williams will still decide to pack it in and move on to something else after it's all done. But obviously we already know how that will turn out. Things would be pretty much the same as they were in our timeline, just with the addition of Ian Cuthbertson's alternate Fifth Doctor. So let's make things a bit more interesting by having Williams stay on for season 18. Perhaps that Alan Bromley drama never happens after all. Or it does, but it doesn't push Williams into quitting the show, and perhaps he has a better relationship with Cuthbertson than he did with Tom Baker, which helps to convince him to stay on for another year. Either way, what would Graham Williams staying on for another year mean for the course of season 18? Well, it would now be pretty different to what we got in our timeline, as a lot of the stories that were made for our timeline's version were for the direction new producer John Nathan Turner and script editor Christopher H. Bidmead wanted to take the show in, i.e. what is known as hard science fiction. So we'll have to turn to the world of Unmade Stories again for an idea of what a Graham Williams-led season 18 would be like. Also, I think Douglas Adams would still leave as script editor, as the various media forms of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would be really taken off by 1980, and I can't imagine Christopher Bidmead's vision for the show working well with Graham Williams's, so we would have to have a very different script editor for this alternate season 18. Now, J&T had originally considered Johnny Byrne to take over as script editor once Douglas Adams had left. The reason why he considered Byrne in particular was due to the fact that they had previously worked together on All Creatures Great and Small, but Byrne had declined as he didn't want to move from his Norwich home all the way to London. But even if we were to say that Byrne didn't have these feelings in this alternate timeline, I still don't think it would be him. Graham Williams wouldn't have had that same kind of prior relationship with Byrne, so it wouldn't make sense for Williams to even consider him. So instead I'm going to choose someone that Graham Williams would be familiar with, someone who had written for the show over the past few years, that being David Fisher, who had written The Stones of Blood, The Androids of Tara and The Creature from the Pit. Now, Fisher only ever had script writing experience in our timeline, and never became a script editor for anything. But I reckon he would still be approached about it, as Douglas Adams hardly had any script editing experience either, and that didn't stop him from getting the role for season 17, did it? I know some of you might still think it's a bit of a stretch, but it's the best I could come up with. Perhaps to help ease Fisher into his new role, Douglas Adams might agree to stick around a little bit for the first half of the season, so that he could mentor Fisher and help him settle into things in a sort of transitionary period. But how likely this is with how busy Adams would be with Hitchhikers is debatable. We now come to the tricky matter of Shada. It would still encounter the same behind the scenes issues as it did in our universe, and so it would still be unable to finish off season 17. But with Graham Williams now staying on, I think there's a good chance that it could get finished in time to be the first story of the following season. He did try his hardest to get it completed in our timeline after all, so I think it's fairly likely that he would move it back to the beginning of season 18's production schedule and broadcast order. Perhaps reducing its episode count from 6 to 4 would help get it over the finish line and fit more into its new slot. But I'm not exactly an expert on how TV productions work, so I don't know if reducing its amount of episodes would actually help get it done. But we'll just say it does for the sake of this scenario. So Shada now starts off season 18, and here's how the rest of the alternate season would then go. Number 2, The Psychonauts by David Fisher, 4-parter. Number 3, The Doomsday Contract, 4 parts. I won't say who would have written this, as I'm not too sure actually. The original version was going to be written by John Lloyd, who then has to abandon work on it so that he could become the producer on Not the 9 O'Clock News. Lloyd gave his permission for another writer to work on the storyline, with Alan Pryor then working on a second version of it. But his stuff was rejected, with Douglas Adams trying to find another writer to work on it instead, again with Lloyd's permission. But Adams then left the show and nothing further was ever done with the story idea. So whoever Adams could have got to replace Alan Pryor is who would have written this timeline's version of the story. I'm half tempted to credit the story to a generic name like John Smith or the infamous David Agnew. Number 4, The Tearing of the Veil by Alan Drury, another 4-parter. This would have seen the introduction of a new companion for the Doctor, as Lalla Ward would still want to leave as Romana, even if Williams had stayed on as producer. At least, that's the impression I get from interviews, anyway. This new companion would be called Mary, and she would be a young girl who has educated herself in everything to do with science and spiritualism by reading lots of books. But due to her living in the Victorian era, which is when this story would be set, opportunities for women to go to university are limited, and she isn't able to afford it as she doesn't come from a wealthy background. She would help the Doctor, Romana and K9 save the day, and the Doctor would invite her to come travel with them in the TARDIS, being very impressed with her. I was thinking Belinda Main of Delta and the Bannerman fame could play her, as she was someone who was considered to play the first incarnation of Romana before she later played Delta. I should say that the idea of Mary is one that me and my friend Billy Bob came up with, so if you want to use her for your own projects, then please ask permission from one of us first. Number 5, Aranella by Pennant Roberts, again a 4-parter. Number 6, Sealed Orders by Christopher Priest, the season's only 6-parter. This would have been the last story for Romana and K9, with them both deciding to stay on Gallifrey to help the Time Lords get everything back to normal, after the events of this story have shaken Time Lord society to its very core. If you didn't already know, Sealed Orders was supposed to be a political thriller set on Gallifrey, where the Doctor is ordered to kill Romana by the Time Lords. A time paradox then causes another Doctor to appear, presumably still played by Ian Cuthbertson in this timeline, as there's no proper multi-Doctor element mentioned from what I could find online. Now, I should say that I went with these unmade stories in particular as they were ones that had been put forward or commissioned whilst Graham Williams was still the producer in our timeline. So I think it makes sense to go with these if he'd stayed on for another year, even if they were all at various stages. By the time this alternate season 18 would have finished broadcasting, I can imagine Graham Williams having decided that 4 seasons working on the show was more than enough for him. And so a new producer would take over for the alternate season 19, with it still probably being John Nathan Turner. David Fisher might stay on for this season as the script editor, but might leave after it once he realises how different his and JNT's takes on the show are from each other. I also think this would be Ian Cuthbertson's final season as the alternate 5th Doctor, as he would feel like the standard 3 seasons would be enough for him. This alternate season 19 would have the same structure as our timeline's season 18 had, that being 7 serials made up of 28 episodes. It would also be mainly made up of some remaining unmade stories. So here's how I would have it go in terms of stories. Number 1. The Leisure Hive by David Fisher, with Fisher being granted permission by the BBC to write a story of his own, as sometimes happened with past script editors. Number 2. Frau Noan by Andrew Stevenson. I couldn't find much about this unmade story idea, and the same goes for numbers 3, 5 and 6 too. Number 3. Mark of Lumos by Keith Miles. Number 4. Into the Comet by James Follett. Follett originally submitted this to Douglas Adams in 1979, who rejected the storyline. Follett then resubmitted the idea a year later when Christopher Bidmead was script editor in our timeline. So perhaps he could have done the same thing when David Fisher would be there in this alternate timeline. Also, since this story would have been about Halley's Comet, perhaps this would prevent Attack of the Cybermen from being able to use it as part of its own plot later on. And maybe it would be replaced with a more generic comet or even an asteroid instead, perhaps. Or maybe it's just used in Attack anyway, with the Doctor remarking to Perry how he'd encountered it before. Number 5. Romanoids by Jeff Lowe. Number 6. Soldor and the Plastoids by John Bennett. This would be Mary's final story, with her being replaced by Tegan, still played by Janet Fielding. And number 7. Space Whale by Pat Mills and John Wagner. This was the unmade story that kept being worked on by Mills, after Wagner wasn't interested in the project anymore in 1981, although we'll say that it gets made before he drops out in this scenario. Mills worked on this continuously for many years in our universe, with it being first submitted as a 4th Doctor story, then reworked into a 5th Doctor one for season 20, which would have introduced Turlough, and then changed to a 6th Doctor one for season 22, before it was finally abandoned in 1985. For this scenario, we'll say that the original version is submitted to Fisher and JNT, with a fewer amount of revisions being made to it. This would serve as Ian Cuthbertson's final story as the Doctor. Peter Davison would then take over as the Doctor, with JNT still deciding to cast him after working with him on All Creatures Great and Small. Davison would obviously now be the 6th Doctor in this scenario. Now, due to how things have gone so far, Davison's era is going to be a bit different to how it was in our timeline. His first season, season 20, would be a combination of our timeline's seasons 18 and 19. So it would go like this in terms of stories. Number 1. Project Zeta Sigma by John Flanagan and Andrew McCulloch. This would now be Davison's first story as it was originally supposed to be. The Master wouldn't be in this version of the story as his return will be touched on later in the season. It might not make much sense for Flanagan and McCulloch to write this without them having written Megalos first, but it's the best I could come up with. Number 2. Fall to Doomsday by Terence Dudley. Number 3. Full Circle by Andrew Smith. This would still introduce Adric as a new companion. Number 4. State of Decay by Terence Dix. Number 5. Warrior's Gate by Stephen Gallagher. Number 6. Kinder by Christopher Bailey. And number 7. The Keeper of Traken by Johnny Byrne. This would still introduce Nyssa and Anthony Ainley's version of the Master. The Master stealing Tremas's body and then escaping Traken in his TARDIS would now serve as basically a cliffhanger to lead into the next season. Nyssa would now join the Doctor, Tegan and Adric in the TARDIS straight away, perhaps so that they can try and find Tremas together, not knowing what has happened to him. For this to work, the Master would need to steal his body and leave the planet before the Doctor, Tegan and Adric have departed. I should also mention that Christopher Bidmead would be the script editor for this alternate season 20. Then we come to the matter of what to do with the 5 Doctors. Now, originally, JNT had wanted it to be part of our timeline's season 21. This was because of some complicated issues surrounding the new production schedule that our timeline season 19 had introduced. He had wanted our season 20 to air in autumn of 1982, as he had realised that our season 19 would only be running for 13 weeks, from January of that year. JNT then wanted our season 21 to be broadcast in autumn of the following year, so that it could feature a 20th anniversary special during November 1983. He had asked the BBC's head of serials and series David Reed about this, with Reed then discussing it with BBC One's then controller of programmes, Alan Hart. Hart rejected the idea as he didn't want Doctor Who to be airing at the same time as another Peter Davison-led series would be, called Sink or Swim. This was because he and other BBC high-ups didn't feel like it was fair for Davison to take up so much of the schedule at that time of year. This was one of the reasons for why our timeline season 19 didn't air until early 1982, as opposed to the previous autumn, which had been the standard practice for the show for most of Tom Baker's era. But let's say for this alternate timeline, John Nathan Turner insists on the 5 Doctors, now called the 6 Doctors, being part of season 21, as he didn't think it was fair to have such a big anniversary special as part of Peter Davison's first season in the role. Hart agrees with this, but says that it would still be best if the anniversary special was a 90-minute episode, and would recommend that it start off Davison's second season. So the alternate season 21 would go like this. Number 1. The 6 Doctors by Terence Dix. This would be where Nyssa finds out that the Master has stolen her father's body. Ian Cuthbertson would have to be represented through archive footage as he wasn't acting at the time after he'd had a stroke in 1982. I should also say that this is one of the reasons why I had him do just the 3 seasons, as then that way he wouldn't still be playing the part when he had his stroke, as the alternate season 19 would still have been filmed in 1981, before he'd had it. Tom Baker might have been more willing to come back as he had been gone from the show a lot longer than in our timeline. Although, then again, he might still refuse, as he might still be annoyed with the BBC accepting his resignation at the time. Number 2, Arc of Infinity by Johnny Byrne. Number 3, Earthshock by Eric Saward. Adric would still die at the end. Number 4, Snake Dance by Christopher Bailey. Number 5, Mawdryn Undead by Peter Grimwade. Turlough is still introduced in this as a new companion. Number 6, Enlightenment by Barbara Clegg. This still sees the conclusion of what we would know as the Black Guardian trilogy, but is now known as the Black Guardian duology in this timeline. I've saved Terminus for the next season, as I don't think Nyssa should leave just yet. And number 7, Castrovalva by Christopher H. Bidmead. This would obviously need to be different to how it was in our timeline in some ways, as the 5th Doctor would have already been well established as an incarnation, and wouldn't still be recovering from his regeneration. Eric Saward would still take over as script editor for this season, and this season would obviously start off with the 6 Doctors airing in November of 1983, with the rest of the season then following a couple of months later in January 1984. Also, this alternate Season 21 would follow our Timelines Season 20's format, of marking the 20th anniversary with having a returning element from the show's past in every story. Then the alternate Season 22 would go like this. Number 1, Terminus by Stephen Gallagher, with all of the Black Guardian elements obviously removed and still serving as Nyssa's final story. Number 2, The Awakening by Eric Pringle. Number 3, Frontiers by Christopher H. Bidmead. Number 4, Resurrection of the Daleks by Eric Saward. Number 5, Planet of Fire by Peter Grimwade. Number 6, The Caves of Androzani by Robert Holmes. This would still be Peter Davison's final story as the Doctor. And number 7, The Twin Dilemma by Anthony Stephen. This would still see the introduction of Colin Baker, now playing the 7th Doctor, and it would obviously still be a new Doctor's debut tacked onto the end of the previous incarnation's final season. And from there, things would play out pretty similarly to how they did in our timeline, just that our timeline's Season 22 would now be the alternate Season 23. Our Season 23 becomes Season 24, and etc. And a numbering of Doctors would now go up by 1. So Colin is 7, McCoy is 8, McGann is 9, etc. This would mean that when it came time to this universe's Time of the Doctor, David Tennant's regeneration in The Stolen Earth / Journey's End wouldn't be counted as the Doctor using up a regeneration. I say this because obviously there would be no need for Moffat to include that in a Doctor's original regeneration cycle, now with the numbering of Doctors having been altered slightly. I should also say that the titles for Ian Cuthbertson's era would just be versions of the 1974 and 1980 titles, but now with Cuthbertson's face in them instead of Tom Baker's. But anyway, in conclusion, if Tom Baker had indeed left after season 16, then it could have led to some interesting butterfly effects rippling down the timeline. We would have most likely had a very different 5th Doctor, with his tenure potentially having some repercussions and effects on the Peter Davison era, which is why, as much as I would have loved to have seen Ian Cuthbertson's take on the Doctor, I'm a bit hesitant about whether I would have liked how this scenario played out. Peter Davison is one of my favourite Doctors, so I don't really know how to feel about his tenure getting so dramatically affected like this. And as much as I find the idea of Tom Baker leaving after season 16 fascinating to think about, I think I prefer the idea that he leaves after season 15 instead. I just think that works a lot better and doesn't cause the potential ramifications that this scenario did. But this was still a good one to think about, and I hope it was worth the long wait for those of you who requested it. But anyway, so there's my take on what if Tom Baker had left after season 16. But what did you think? Did you like my take on it or not? And would you have done anything differently? Please let me know in the comments section below. This will be the last What If video for 2024, so I won't be doing any more until at least sometime in the new year, so I hope you all don't mind that. Anyway, so thanks for watching, I hope you liked it. Please don't forget to press that subscribe button below, as well as press the bell icon at the side of it, so that you'll stay notified of when all my new videos come out, and I shall see you all in another video. And as you can probably tell, my voice has gotten pretty tired at points during this recording, because I've been recording this video literally in the space of just a few hours on the exact same day, so yeah, I'm going to need a bit of a... my voice is going to need a bit of a rest after this. So until the next time, bye bye!